A billionaire father witnesses a black waitress lead his disabled son in a dance step, which subsequently transforms her life forever. The silence that fell over Kingsley's, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, was so thick that it seemed to have weight. Conversation stopped, cutlery froze in midair, and dozens of eyes were focused on the tiny space between the tables. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery was visibly shaking, his legs trapped in metal braces, and he hesitated as he reached out to Deanna Johnson, the restaurant's only black waitress. The live piano had just started a gentle melody, and the boy's impulse to ask someone to dance came suddenly. "Sir, control your son." Manager Thornton's sharp voice broke the silence. "That's inappropriate. This is not a dance." Richard Montgomery, the owner of Montgomery Investments and one of the wealthiest men in the nation, swallowed hard because it was the first time he had taken Lucas out to dinner in public since the accident 2 years prior that had partially paralyzed his legs, a mistake he would never repeat. Lucas sat down when the order came, low but firm. Diana remained still, her gaze shifting between the billionaire manager and the boy whose hand was still hanging in the air. In her 5 years there, she had learned to blend in, especially with clients like Montgomery. "Mr. Thornton, I'm leaving. My shift is over." Her voice sounded calm as she put her apron on the tray. To everyone's surprise, she smiled at Lucas and took his hand. "I can't dance in an apron," she said. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked. Before anyone could stop him, Lucas took a hesitant step forward, his foot dragging painfully across the floor and the metal of his braces screeching. Diana didn't try to guide him or hurry him. Instead, she simply adjusted her own pace to his. "She's getting fired tomorrow," a woman at the next table whispered. Richard was paralyzed when he suddenly remembered Elizabeth, his late wife, dancing with Lucas in the living room. "It's not about perfection," she said. "It's about connection." For the first time since the accident, he was leading Mr. Montgomery, without any guidance, assistance, or correction. The manager's voice interrupted his thoughts, saying, "I can assure you that this will never happen again. She will be properly disciplined." Richard didn't respond, and the entire restaurant seemed to wait for his reaction. After all, a man of his power could end anyone's career with a single word. Employees stopped what they were doing, and other customers watched with morbid curiosity. The only sound that reverberated in his mind was Lucas's smile. Diana led the boy back to the table after 3 dance steps. As though addressing an adult, she said formally, "It was an honor that you asked me out." When she turned to leave, Richard stopped her. "Wait." His voice sounded different, almost unrecognizable to himself. "What's your full name?" "Diana Johnson." Sir Richard nodded slowly. "Diana Johnson," he repeated as if memorizing it. Then, he took a card from inside his jacket and held it out to her. "My office tomorrow at 10 a.m. The entire restaurant held its breath. Diana accepted the card without showing any emotion, but her hand trembled slightly. "Dad," Lucas called as she walked away. "Why did you do that?" The query hovered over the air like an accusation. Richard watched his son, and for a moment saw not only the child Elizabeth had left in his care, but a whole human being whose needs and wants he had systematically ignored for 2 years. As dinner went on in awkward silence, no one noticed Diana's glance before she left, not out of fear or resignation but from a calm determination that contrasted with the storm brewing in Richard Montgomery's eyes. If this story about dignity and transformation is already touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow how a small act of respect can start a silent revolution capable of permanently changing lives. The individuals walking past her wore clothing that most likely cost more than her monthly rent. So Diana Johnson, wearing her best outfit, a navy blue skirt and white blouse she had purchased on sale, felt out of place right away as it reflected the morning sunlight. "Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery," she stated to the receptionist, who gave her a diagnostic look before calling to say, "Miss Winters will see you on the 18th floor." Diana inhaled deeply while holding her battered purse to her chest in the elevator. She didn't feel afraid. Rather, she felt a calm resolve that came from having dealt with much worse. Miss Winters was a woman in her 40s with a keen eye and perfect posture. "Mr. Montgomery is on a conference call. Please follow me." Diana felt the odd stares of the staff as she passed through the executive offices. An escort of a black woman was so uncommon that it sparked rumors that he had you fired, didn't he? Winters asked abruptly as they were alone in a waiting room. "It happens that powerful clients call and people like you lose your jobs. People like me, you know what I mean." Winters adjusted her glasses, and employees who didn't know where they were smiled, not amused, and asked, "Where exactly would that be?" Before Winters could answer, her phone rang saying, "He'll see you now." Richard Montgomery's office took up half the when Diana politely greeted him. "Mr. Montgomery." Richard twisted his face into a mask of practiced control. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan appeared to be a far-off playground. The man stood looking out at the city as though it were his own property. "I appreciate your presence, Miss Johnson." "Please," he said, indicating a chair. Diana knew the deliberate stillness that followed right away. It was a ploy used to get worried people to talk too much and implicate themselves. When Richard eventually said, "Excuse me, Education College," Diana maintained eye contact. Richard was surprised when something flashed across his face. He had a steady bachelor's degree in child development from NYU, an incomplete master's degree in special education, and he worked as a waiter. "Actually work 3 jobs. As a tutor when I can get students, at a restaurant, and at a bookstore on the weekends." Richard moved to her table and picked up a folder. "I did some research on you, Miss Johnson, because I wanted to know who you were." He hesitated, then danced with my son. He opened the folder, revealing printed photos of a community center called Freedom Steps, which you founded 6 years ago. "I co-founded it with my sister Zoe, a dance program for kids with physical disabilities." Richard looked through some. "I didn't come here to ask you for money, Mr. Montgomery. So why did you come?" "Because you invited me." Richard laughed softly, making a sound that was fair enough. He stood up again, restless, and blinked, genuinely surprised. Richard's face hardened as a therapeutic companion for Lucas, whose son's name seemed difficult for him to say. Diana noticed how his eyes briefly strayed to a picture of a smiling woman holding a baby on the table. "I have the best specialists in the nation," Richard continued. "However, what you did yesterday caused him to pause as though the words had betrayed him. It was just a dance, Mr. Montgomery, and it was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident. The admission was painful. I don't want a dancer for my son. I want someone who can do what you did. Follow instead of lead." Diana studied the man in front of her beneath the facade of power and control, seeing what others might not see. A desperate lost father. "I can pay you 5 times what you're making." Now Diana stood up, and Richard looked shocked, as if he had never heard that phrase before. "I don't work for people who see only my color or my social class before they see my competence," she explained calmly. "I definitely don't work for people who try to buy solutions." To Richard's face flushed as she said, "You're turning down an offer that would solve your financial problems out of pride and dignity." Diana corrected, "Your son deserves more than someone hired to pretend to care." She walked to the door and paused. "You don't know my son," Aina said, "but I know people like him. People whose physical limitations are nothing compared to the invisible cages we build around them." She took a card out of her purse and put it on the table. "Freedom Steps classes are on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring Lucas, the first class is free." Who was clearly eavesdropping behind the door. "Are you crazy?" she asked incredulously. "You just declined an offer from Richard Montgomery?" Diana grinned and said, "Maybe, but I'd rather be insane than property." When Zoe, Diana's sister and the project's co-founder, ran up to her at the community center's reception desk the next Wednesday, she whispered anxiously, fixing her hijab, "There's a Bentley parked outside, and you won't believe who's inside." Through the window, Diana could see that Richard was still in the opulent vehicle with Lucas in the backseat, staring anxiously out. As they watched the car door open, Lucas got out slowly, adjusting his gadgets, and then, to everyone's surprise, Richard got out too. The billionaire looked out of place in his casual pants and sweater, an obvious attempt to dress less formally, but still screaming privilege. "I told you he'd come," Diana murmured more to herself, and Zoe stared at her. "What did you do?" Diana did not. Her eyes, however, glistened with a secret that not even her sister fully understood. In her small Bronx apartment, beneath her bed, was a notebook containing notes about men like Richard Montgomery and children like Lucas from years of observation, research, and a plan that had started with a simple acceptance of an invitation to dance. Richard Montgomery, in his world of glass towers and limitless bank accounts, didn't realize what he couldn't imagine. Diana Johnson wasn't just a waitress who had accepted his son's request to dance. She was a woman with a mission, and his empire of privilege and seclusion was about to face its biggest challenge: the simple fact that some of the most important lessons in life cannot be purchased. Operating out of an old community warehouse, steps featured handcrafted posters that adorned the walls with phrases like "your rhythm, your rules, and every move counts." When Richard and Lucas arrived, children with various mobility devices practiced free movements to the sound of a light beat. Diana, dressed simply and bearing the program logo, approached the children in awe. A girl in a wheelchair spun in precise circles, and a boy with a prosthetic leg created a series of steps. Richard remarked, visibly uncomfortable, "There is structure," to which Diana responded, "It's just not the one you recognize." She turned to Lucas and said, Would you like to become involved?" The child nodded enthusiastically, but he looked at his father hesitantly. "Go on," Richard whispered tensely. "I'll be right here." As Diana escorted Lucas to the group, Zoe went up to Richard and offered him a chair. "The first day is always the hardest," Zoe said, adding, "for the parents, not the kids." "This isn't therapy," Richard countered. "I hired the best rehabilitation specialists, and how has that been working for Lucas?" Zoe asked gently. The door of the studio opened, and an older woman with gray hair and elegant braids and a commanding presence entered. Leaning on an ornate cane, Dr. Elaine Mercer, a neuroscientist who specializes in Dr. Merchant. "I didn't expect to see you here. I oversee the research program." She explained that we're studying how non-directive approaches to movement affect neural reconfiguration in children with motor challenges. Richard frowned. "I assumed this was just a community dance class." Diana returned, leaving Lucas exploring movements with another child. Freedom Steps is a pilot motor rehabilitation program based on the theory of movement autonomy. "I thought this was just a community dance class. Because we don't have enough money yet, and because people like you rejected us 3 times, you work as a waitress. You were Dr. Mercer's assistant on the proposals, and Dr. Mercer corrected that Diana has an incomplete master's degree because she had to leave college to care for her sister, but her theoretical work is groundbreaking. You knew who I was at the restaurant," Richard concluded, "from the moment you walked in. And when Lucas got up to dance, I saw the opportunity to show it, but I couldn't tell if it was staged. Instead, I chose to follow a group of reporters as they entered the studio." Richard tensed up right away, wondering what part 2 of the plan was. Diana smiled a little as Zoe showed him a recently published article about revolutionary motor rehabilitation methodology, which shows promising results. "We published our first results today," Dr. Merchant explained, "and we invited the press. You played a publicity stunt with my son." Richard's tone was icy. Diana ushered him into a side room with pictures of scores of kids on the walls, each with handwritten progress notes. The final wall was blank, so he inquired, "What's that?" "If we had the money, we could construct a complete rehabilitation facility in the future. Children a year instead of 50. You planned all of this," Richard muttered. "The dance and the meeting brought me here on press day. 4 months ago, you called off our meeting without reading the proposal, and I promised myself that I would find a way." However, Diana Zoe interrupted, and Lucas was in the middle of the room with other kids. Someone had turned off the music, and everyone was silently watching as the boy took off one of his braces and was attempting to balance on just one support. Richard began to move forward, but Diana whispered, "Watch," and to everyone's surprise, especially his father, he took a full step without full support. It was a little shaky, but it was all his. The kids cheered, and the camera flashed. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Diana said softly, "because it's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps on your own." Richard watched his son, not as a problem to be solved, but as a whole person finding his own strength. "This could have been done without manipulating me," he said. "Finally, it could have been if you had answered our calls or read our proposals 3 times. The reporters noticed Richard, and a murmur grew as Lucas, unaware of the tension, kept practicing his new. The man who controlled every aspect of his life now faced a decision that no amount of money could buy. His gaze shifted between his smiling son and the reporters waiting for his reaction. Richard Montgomery was cornered with an expression of pure concentration. He had 2 options: either embrace the moment his son had created between the power he had always wielded and the freedom his son needed, or withdraw in anger, confirming to the press his reputation as cold and calculating. A reporter approached Richard Montgomery and asked, "Could you comment on your presence at Freedom Steps today? Is it true that your foundation rejected funding this program 3 times?" Richard looked at Lucas, who was still practicing his new step, unaware of the political tension, and then to everyone's attention. Surprise, especially Diana's, he grinned and said, "You know what's hardest for someone in my position?" Richard spoke loud enough for everyone to hear him admit, "When we're wrong." A stunned silence fills the room. The Montgomery Foundation is happy to announce a commitment to fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years and to build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology developed by Dr. Merchant and Ms. Johnson. Camera flashes exploded, and Zoe let out a cry of surprise, but with the stipulation that Ms. Johnson maintain total control over the program. And it's 3 months later. Bulldozers were setting up the new Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't the most opulent project the Montgomery Foundation had ever funded, but it was the most inventive, with every space created with direct input from the kids and their families. Diana oversaw construction on a regular basis, but never by herself. Lucas frequently showed up, sometimes bringing other kids along, and to the staff's continued surprise, Richard Montgomery also showed up quietly to watch the progress. "I never thought you'd actually show up at board meetings," Diana remarked one afternoon as they went over the plans. "I never thought I'd have to study neuroplasticity at 50, Richard said, rubbing his weary eyes. In front of him was a scientific article with post-it notes, but now we're looking at the man curiously. "Is this part of your public penance, or do you really care?" Lucas asked to have his second brace taken off last week, and I know he told me that his previous physical therapist said that would be impossible for at least 2 years. Diana smiled, "But you fired her because you told me she was mistaken, and she was." She pointed to a picture of Lucas balancing with just one crutch, showing that he's progressing more quickly than any conventional medical prediction. Richard asked abruptly, "Because you never accepted my apology." At the opening ceremony 6 months later, the contrast with that night in the restaurant couldn't have been stronger. Lucas, now wearing only a lightweight brace on his left leg, led a small choreographed routine with 3 other children. His movements were still limited, but they flowed with a confidence no doctor had predicted. Richard watched from a distance, not interfering, saying, "I don't need you to hold him anymore. I apologized, you redirected resources, changed policies, and funded our program." "That's not an apology, it's compensation." A reporter approached Mr. Montgomery, asking how it feels to see your son's progress. He looked at Lucas, who was now helping the younger girl find her balance. He was proud of what he's accomplished, not what he's overcome, but of what he's created for others. "What has been the biggest lesson you've learned on this journey?" Richard Montgomery, who was once known only for his financial empire, looked directly into the camera and said, "It's important that I be around Richard, but he still needs me to be around. The guts to follow when someone shows them a better way." A year later, the Freedom Steps.